Delighted to introduce our presenters today for the program. Humanities Texas has had a long and important relationship with Andrew Torget. Over the past decade, he's served on the faculty of over 30 teacher programs and as a trusted consultant on a number of other projects. To say he has become an integral part of our teacher programming is an understatement. To give you a little bit of background information, Dr. Torget is a historian of 19th century North America at the University of North Texas, where he holds the University Distinguished Teaching Professorship. He's an award-winning speaker. He's been featured at Harvard, Stanford, Rice, Duke, Johns Hopkins, and the Library of Congress. He is the author and editor of 5 books. His most recent, Seeds of Empire, won 12 prizes and awards and was hailed by Texas Monthly as the most nuanced and authoritative rewriting of Texas's origin myth to date. He's the recipient of a number of awards, including my favorite, the Guinness World Record for the world's longest history lesson, which was seen online by more than 30 million people. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Torget, it was over 26 hours. Is that correct?
It was 26 and a half hours. And I always say the half part because that last half hour was the hardest part.
That's what got you over the finish line. In 2021, he was named as a finalist for Texan of the Year by Dallas Morning News. In 2023, he served as U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Germany and visiting professor of history at the University of Bremen, where he was just recently named a finalist for the Berningshausen, I don't know if that's how you say it. Okay, prize for outstanding teaching. Anyway, has very many accolades. He's a important scholar, and he has hard work on his Texas History for Teachers project at UNT, which has the goal of developing a full and complete curriculum for Texas history teachers mapped to the TEKS. And we are very supportive of that project. You're going to be incredibly lucky to hear from Dr. Torget today. He's wonderful at working with classroom teachers, and he really does so much for teachers across Texas. I'm also delighted to introduce our second presenter, Courtney Abubakar. She is the lead curriculum developer for Texas History for Teachers at the University of North Texas. She earned her BA and MA in history at the University of North Texas and Texas State University, and she taught 7th grade Texas history in Wichita Falls ISD for 8 years. Her time serving a diverse population of students from very socioeconomic, cultural, and academic backgrounds has given her a passion for creating engaging educational materials. And we're so excited to be spending time this week with both Dr. Torget and with Courtney Abubakar. So please join me in welcoming them, and I'll go ahead and turn the program over to both of them.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It is so good to see you guys. I love the waves. I recognize so many faces here. It's one of my favorite things. Thanks for joining us on a hot July afternoon for History Happy Hour, Texas history style. So we're going to be setting this up. Me and my co-conspirator, Courtney Abubakar, have a whole lot of stuff for you guys. And we're going to be talking about the Spanish and the Mexican period and teaching that within the classroom. Because in my experience, this is sort of the foundational material for so much of how we understand the rest of Texas history that we get to, especially in the classes that I get to teach it in. But it's also one of the most misunderstood. We tend to run through a lot of the Spanish period where the Spanish are kind of flailing every which way from Sunday. And then the Mexican period just sort of kind of starts in the ashes of the Spanish collapse, but really just takes off from there and really doesn't seem to have much connection to what came before it. But I want to just set this whole thing up as we get started by saying that the theme of today, tomorrow, and Thursday is going to be connections. So if you're taking notes, if you're writing anything down, just write that one word, connections. Because between the Spanish period and then the Mexican period, there are these threads that I'm going to be hitting, Courtney's going to be hitting, we're going to come back to several different ways of connectivity across time, that one thing leads to another. And I think that's really important for our students to see and understand, because I think for a lot of students, I know at the college level, but my daughter just finished 7th grade taking Texas history. It can often feel like things just happen in isolation when we talk about these different things, and making those connections clear not only helps history make sense, but it helps them remember why these things matter, that one thing does make possible the next big event, whatever that might end up being. All right. Um, Now, the way we're going to do this is the way we do a lot of webinars. I know a lot of you guys are veterans, but some of you guys are new as well. So we're going to break this up into 3 sections. I'm going to teach some of the history of a particular section, and then Courtney's going to come in and give you guys some resources that you can take into the classroom, ready-made, ready to go, to bridge that content directly into the classroom itself. Okay. And then along the way, this is my big request for you guys. All right. The chat. Please use the chat. Please type in questions for me, questions for Courtney. As I'm going along, I'm going to have questions for you guys. I'd love to see you guys talk about things in there, throw ideas, resources. We're online. This is Zoom, but you guys are really each other's best resources. And one of the great things that Humanities Texas makes possible is bringing you guys together in a way that you guys can also share, whether it's ideas and sometimes resources. But light up the chat for me, please. Okay. With that, I'm going to share my screen and we are going to get started here. All right. You guys see that? Fantastic. All right. So we're going to start off. All right. So we're starting off section 1, American Indians, Spanish explorers. All right. And what we're going to talk about in this first section is, again, a constant line through the 19th century, well, 18th century and 19th century, when we're trying to understand the Spanish period and the Mexican period as well, is where the native people are, what they're doing, and try to connect all of this to the geography of the first unit you guys do on Texas history, native Texas and its people. So the first section, my essential question I wanted to frame everything with, is to tie geography to where these Indians live, because that's going to affect everything that happens. How the Spanish get there, what they think of the region, how they fail in the region, all is going to be connected to the geography of Texas. And the way I always start my Texas history class is, I always have my students write one phrase at the very beginning: geography matters. All right, it's determinative, it changes and fixes everything along the way. And so our question here is, how did differences in the regional geography of Texas influence the lifestyles of native tribes in each and every region? All right, that is foundational to understanding the Spanish, and then it'll be foundational to understanding what happens after. All right, so I start with this map with my students. Texas. And I always start with, let's talk about geography, which is the last thing they want to start with. No one, unless they're a geographer, I think, is super fascinated by talking about regionality and all the different pieces that come with it. But it's fundamentally important to walk them through all these different pieces, right? I know you guys know the geography of Texas, so I'm not going to beat that into the ground. And there's a lot of different maps that show fine variation and all of this sort of stuff. But I always tell my students, there's some basic major areas that you just need to know. There's the Southern High and Central Plains, this just massive grassland region that has a thin topsoil, but a whole lot of grasslands over there that's good for grazing and all of that. There's a transition zone up here where I am, North Texas, right? It's often called the Cross Timbers, that moves into what I think is the other major area, East Texas, which is the Eastern Piney Woods, the massive, densely rich soil that has huge forests, pine trees and cedar and all kinds of stuff, really thickly wooded, in part because the geography of East Texas is just such a rich soil type. It's much more tied to Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, those kinds of rich soil areas than it is the West Texas territories, right? Then you move down onto the Gulf Coast right down here, right? And the Gulf Coast it's rich in some ways, but it's sparer in others, especially as you get closer to the coastline itself, especially down towards the coastline. It's swampier, it's muggier as you get after the end of the last ice age, right? This is an area of transition as well in this sort of coastal zone region down here. Then you get down into the valley, modern day South Texas, which is sandier, grittier. Today it's incredibly fertile territory because we can dump water onto this territory. We can grow all kinds of fruits and vegetables down there. But at this time, when our story begins, it's a sandier, grittier, much more arid kind of place. And that's true of the plains as well, because once you get past the 100th meridian, essentially right here, rainfall drops off pretty dramatically. And so you get into these western Texas territories that we know today as much more arid, open regions, right? You have the Trans-Pecos out here in the far west, which I don't talk much about in my Texas class because we just don't get to it a whole lot out there, that mountainous region. But it's kind of an extension again of this sort of aridness that moves from the eastern portions of Texas out to the western portions of Texas, right? And understanding that geography, that sort of basic layout of the stage at which this drama is going to take place matters for when the earliest people come into Texas, right? So you guys know this story, but the earliest people start coming over into the Americas about 20,000 years ago, more or less, roughly speaking, at the end of the last ice age, when we have these massive ice sheets that are connecting Asia to North America. And so these early people start moving across the great land masses. And I always ask my students, why? Are they coming because they can see America just over the horizon and they think it looks really neato? They want to check it out? No, of course they're migrating over because they're hunting, grazing animals of various sorts, right? They're coming across the tundra because they're hunting, the woolly mammoth and all these other massive herds that are also grazing and moving their way through these territories, right? And so I tell students when we talk about the beginnings of Texas for this story and these early peoples that come to Texas, it looks a lot like this at the end of the last ice age. There's all kinds of massive animals there in Texas that do not exist today. Woolly mammoth, massive saber-toothed tigers that will tear you to shreds. There were actually massive armadillos that were the size of Volkswagen Beetles at the time, which is just terrifying for me to even consider. But all of those things are wandering around, mostly in the Texas Plains regions, including massive giant bison, which are much larger than modern day bison. When the earliest people come into Texas, they're actually following this beast right here, which is several times taller than your American buffalo of today. Which I always tell my students, this is a hard way to make a living if you're a Native American of this Paleolithic era. Your job is to survive and help your family survive by shoving a pointy stick into the side of one of these massive beasts, which is a great way to get killed on a fairly regular basis. It's a hard life, not something that I would envy or look for at all. But it's all of that that brings the earliest people into Texas. And this is, again, where geography really matters because the highway into Texas is literally the high plains, all right? These massive herds that are moving along North America, moving up and down the modern day Great Plains, they come into Texas on the central high plains, into north central plains and prairies. And that's how the earliest people come into Texas. They come migrating in along this. And for several thousand years, most of the early Texans, if you want to call them that, are living in this Central Plains region, all right? Making their living essentially hunting on foot, trying to kill giant bison. But then the last ice age comes to an end, and we have climate change. And the challenges that come with that are pretty astounding for these early American Indians in places like Texas. For one thing, when the earth starts warming, the giant beasts can't handle that. The gigantism in part was an adaptation for cold weather, help keep your core warm. But mammoths start dying out. More importantly, giant bison start dying out around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. And then there's a terrible drought that hits Texas that about 7,000 years ago that persists for 4,000 years. You can imagine that. And so what that means in all ways is that life on the plains, as these early Indians have had it, just doesn't work anymore. They can't survive. And so they have to adapt in all kinds of ways and then spread out from there every which direction that they can possibly go. And so at the end of the last ice age, various Indian groups start spreading out in all directions. and start adapting themselves to all the different kinds of geographies in Texas, right? And so they move out into the eastern piney woods. They move down to the Gulf Coastal Plain. Some of them move down into South Texas. Some of them move out further west, out into the areas near Big Bend and the Guadalupe Mountains and things like that. Only one group stays out in the plains, but everyone else scatters every which direction. And so they start adapting how they feed themselves and how they provide for themselves. The bow and arrow is, let's say, discovered, but becomes common in Texas around 600 AD or so. Corn, which comes up from central Mexico, becomes more commonly planted in Texas also about 600 AD or so, around the same time as the bow and arrow. And so what you have is this development of all these different tribes moving to the different geographies where they are. And in those different places, they start developing cultures of their own that are specific to that geography. And that's one of the points that I always hit with my students really hard, is that these different groups move to different parts of Texas to survive. And then when they get there, they adapt themselves very directly to that particular geography. And it shapes those tribes, it shapes their cultures, it shapes their way of life, as they become very closely tied to the particular land in which they have decided to make their home. So by the time we get to 1500, which is the eve of European arrival in the Americas, this is the basic kind of layout of landscape of where the different native groups are in Texas. I always like to tell students, so we just covered, 20,000 years of history in about 5 minutes. We're going to slow down now and dive in a little bit more deeply into these particular groups, right? So again, we're laying this is important to do with our students. This is laying the framework and the foundation for what happens when the Spanish come, because otherwise what the Spanish do is not going to make a whole lot of sense unless the students understand both the geography and how that has shaped Native American life in Texas before the Spanish show up. That's the connective piece and the connective tissue that they really have to grasp and understand. So let's go around that geography then with these particular groups and sort of talk about how they've adapted to their particular places and why that's going to matter. Okay. So the first group I'm going to start with is the one in East Texas up here, the Caddos. All right. And the Caddos, they're in far East Texas. They're in the big piney woods over there, right? So what they've got going for them are rich soils that are really good for agriculture. Right? It is a prosperous geography which they have made their homes, and it's sort of in the far expanse of the Mississippi River Valley there. And so the Caddos develop these very large populations. We estimate there's about 200,000 of them or so, not just in East Texas, but over into Louisiana by the time of European arrival. And they build these massive villages that are built around agriculture. They've built their lives around the production of corn in particular. They grow an enormous amount of it, and they do tremendously well because of it. And when they grow that much and they're able to feed themselves, their population grows fairly dramatically. They build large societies built around these different villages in different places that are interconnected with one another. They've got sophisticated systems of governance that help control this whole territory up there. And they really become the merchants of Indian life within Texas, because they have so much surplus of the corn that they've grown that they can trade that for all kinds of other things with all kinds of other groups. And they become, therefore, economically and then militarily very powerful within the Texas landscape. So when you think of the Caddos, what you really want to think is a group that's taken full advantage of the fertility of the soil in which they're living and the great expanse that makes possible for them in terms of their society. All right. Move down the coast. We have the Attakapas and the Karankawas. All right. who live along the Gulf Coastal Plain down there, right around, Houston. Think of like southern Louisiana down to Houston, almost down towards Corpus Christi is kind of their territory. Um, they're pretty similar. The one that most people know the most about are the Karankawas, right? And they live, on the Gulf Coast, which is a swampier, more challenging environment in various ways, and they've adapted to that environment in a sort of more nomadic sort of lifestyle. All right. The Karankawas in particular, there's about 5 tribes of the Karankawas at this time. They move between different seasonal villages, so they don't stay in just one place like the Caddos do. They move from place to place, fishing village often to fishing village, but also hunting on the interior, depending on the seasonality. Right? They'll do some fishing during the winter or summer times. They move more inland during the winter times because that makes it far easier for them. And they do plant some food in different places. So they'll plant in one of their camps, come back to it another season. But they move back and forth pretty frequently. All right. So they often trade as well. They'll trade with the Caddos for things they can't get otherwise. And they're less concentrated. There's fewer numbers of them because they don't produce as much as the Karankawas, but they are well established along the Gulf Coast there. But their nomadicism also makes it hard for them to build up large numbers. And so they're fewer in number, although they have full control of where they are along the Gulf Coast. Then we get down into South Texas, all right? And that's where we have this group that isn't really one tribe or a group. We often call these the Coahuiltecans, but Coahuiltecan, that's just a word that historians and anthropologists have made up that means Coahuila and Texas, the sort of area where these two states touch. Coahuila is a northern Mexican state. And it's just South Texas right down here. And South Texas, as I was saying earlier, is a very much more arid, drier at this time, harder to farm kind of place. So it's not very fertile. It's not very good for growing food. It's not really a place you want to live. And so the tribes that are down there are much poorer. And so in many ways, we use the word Coahuiltecan because there's not just one tribe here. There's a bunch of smaller, weaker tribes that have been just shoved down into the valley area by all the other tribes that are much stronger, like the Karankawas, the Attakapas, or the Caddos. We're all pushing their rivals out of the best areas. So the Coahuiltecans are kind of just barely making it down there. All right. And we know this later because when Cabeza de Vaca goes through this territory, he describes some of what life is like for these Coahuiltecan groups. But this is, they're adapted to, they're very nomadic. They're trying to scrape together food and such, but they're fewer in numbers because of, again, their geography is so much more challenging, being west of the 100th meridian, right? Out here in far west Texas, the Humanos, they don't show up for very long in Texas history because they will be hunted to death later by the Apaches. But the Humanos are a group that are kind of like a combination of the Pueblos in New Mexico. They have villages that are made out of adobe, semi-permanent villages, but they also wander out into the plains to hunt bison, right? So they've kind of tried to straddle these two different geographies of far west Texas and the plains areas where they can hunt the remnants, not of the giant bison, but the modern bison that still survive today. You can see an arrow right here where it says Apache pointing down, right? The Apaches are out here in the plains. How are they doing? They're the only ones left in the plains. Everybody else has left because this is not a great territory. Why? Because the Apaches are on foot. And they're not on horseback yet. Horses have not arrived in the New World. That will come with the Europeans. So the Apaches are a very weak, very vulnerable tribe, very few in number. They're wandering around the plains, hoping to find a bison they can stab with a pointy stick. The average hunting range for an Apache warrior was about 200 square miles. If that gives you a sense of just how challenging that would be. So they're making it, but they're in the one area that everybody else abandons, right? Just to give you a sense of that. And then finally, we have up here in North Texas, southern, modern day southern Oklahoma, the Wichitas, which are kind of like the Humanos in the sense that they move out in the plains to hunt bison sometimes, but they also are in the cross timbers where they have permanent villages. So they're kind of a cross between the Caddos and the Apaches in many ways. So it's kind of like the Humanos doing a little bit of both, trying to take advantage of the better geography up here, but also hunting out on the plains when they possibly can. All right. So you can see how geography is affecting all these different tribes and how they're coming together. So in the chat, please tell me, which is the major Indian group that was not in Texas by 1500? Comanches. Yes, exactly. The Comanches. Anybody know where the Comanches are? They're not in Texas. Where are they? Yeah, the Kiowas are not here either. That's true, Jordan. Midwest, good guess. Not really. Todd's got it. Colorado. Now, they're not in Oklahoma yet. Actually, the real answer is the Comanches don't exist yet. The Comanches will not exist until the arrival of horses. All right, they're actually still a part of the Shoshone tribe. So here's some Comanches for you. They're a part of the Shoshones, and then they will shear off of the Shoshones. I practice saying that, I promise. After the horse arrives in a much later sort of period. All right, so the Comanches are not here yet. And that's something I remind my students of, that Indians don't just stay in one place. This is another important thing to remember. They move. They contest space with one another. They have wars between each other. The Comanches will show up in the 1730s. We won't talk about them really till tomorrow. And they're going to be here after the Spanish arrive. All right. Anyway, so all these different groups are out in this territory right here. But I want to emphasize that Texas in North America, in terms of all these different native groups, Texas is a backwater of a backwater, right? It is off on the very edge of where kind of the main action is, right? And I'll give you a little quick sense of that. So see this map right here? This is North and South America. At the time of the Europeans arrived, there's about 12 million Native Americans in what will be Canada and the United States at some point. All right, about 12 million up there. But in what will become Mexico, there's about 35 million. All right. And then below Mexico, what will become Central America and South America, there are 65 million Native Americans. So I say that to say Texas is kind of on the northern, way out there edge of pretty much all of this development right here. All right. As a point of contrast, the real excitement, right, in North America amongst native groups is in modern day Mexico with the Mayan Empire, right? That starts rising up in the around 600 AD or so, reaches its zenith around then, will decline by 900. But it's based in, mostly in the Yucatan down here in southern Mexico today. This is Chichen Itza. Oh, not Chichen Itza. This is in the Yucatan right here. This is a Mayan temple. I don't know if anybody's been down there to see some of these places. They're amazing. They're incredible temples. The math and the science that the Mayans were capable of, they could build these temples that were aligned beautifully with an eclipse between like Venus and the moon that would happen once every 350 years. And I say all that to contrast with the Texas Indians, because at 600 AD, when the Mayans are building this incredible piece of work, the Indians in Texas are saying, look, corn, we can eat this. We just put it in the ground. It'll grow more corn. That's amazing, right? Not to make fun of the Indians in Texas, simply to say that they are dealing in many ways with a more challenging even geography in terms of agriculture and things like that than Indians in the rest of the Americas, right? And so they're the epicenter of a lot of the development that's going on during this time period. Now, the Mayans disappear by 900 AD, and then they're replaced by the Aztecs, who come in around 1300 or so from the north. They establish a military empire in modern-day central Mexico, right? The capital of that is Tenochtitlan, which is on the modern site of what was the site of modern-day Mexico City. And they were kind of like the Romans, in that they defeated all of the people who surrounded them, made them vassals of the Aztec Empire, had been building up this massive, powerful trading empire that controlled so much between modern day Mexico, Central America, and South America, where goods, commerce, ideas, science even are being traded back and forth. They develop a written language, all this amazing stuff. So on the eve of European conquest, here's what's going on, right here in our Gulf of Mexico, right? The Aztec Empire is reaching its zenith around 1500 or so, having all this power and reach. The Indians in Texas are pretty excited about corn, and they've adapted their particular geographies, right? What neither the Indians in Texas nor the Aztecs know is that out in the Gulf over here, starting in 1492, are a bunch of pasty white guys that have shown up from Europe, having gotten lost, thinking they're going to India with Columbus's early expeditions, right? And they're going to get to meet one of these guys very soon in the form of Hernan Cortez, right? Now, I'm sure you guys know the story of Cortez, but I'm going to tell a very shortened version of it just to give you some context so we can understand how it is that Europeans show up in Texas so soon after Europeans show up in the New World at all, which is a very unlikely thing that Europeans would show up in Texas or go to this particular place not long after Columbus discovers the New World. And the reason is because it's connected to Cortez, right? Now, the Europeans, since the Spaniards really, since Columbus shows up, they're just kind of hopscotching over here. Like they're coming island to island in the Caribbean, trying to find if they're discovering gold, silver, all kinds of good stuff. They're finding native groups that they're always enslaving and forcing to dig up gold and silver for them. And they're just kind of figuring out where they are. They don't know that this is the geography that they're dealing with, right? So they're sending out expeditions. And Cortez is given an expedition that's supposed to go from Havana, Cuba. So Havana's right here on Cuba right here. It's going to go from there, and its goal is to just go west, right? We're just going to head out west and see what we smack into. Maybe there's something out there. We'll see. So Cortez, he leaves, and there's a long story. He goes actually against orders, but he leaves with his ship, about 400 guys or so. They head out across the Gulf, and they land on the coast of modern-day Mexico at the site of modern-day Veracruz, which means true cross in Spanish. And so they land on the coast of modern day Mexico, and they look around and go, okay, let's see what's here. Maybe there's gold or silver. And they don't find anything on the beach, obviously. They do find some Indians that live near Veracruz who ask them what they're doing here. And through some very convoluted translations and conversation, Cortez makes clear to them that he's here looking for gold and silver. And the Indians along the coast say, well, we don't have any, but you know who does? Our enemies, the Aztecs. They're just up that road, that direction. You guys want to go check that out, I promise you, right? So Cortez starts marching up towards Mexico. Tenochtitlan will later become Mexico City, where there's Montezuma, the famous last emperor of the Aztecs. There's a long story here. Here's the Spaniards entering Tenochtitlan, which was actually in a lake. It's an amazing geography of what they'd actually created in the city right there. That pyramid over there on the left, you guys see, if you guys know downtown Mexico or historic center of Mexico City, Zocalo, that's actually the site of modern day center of Mexico City right over there. Anyway, the Spaniards come in, they try to take over, they get thrown out, they lay siege to the city, and the city goes down basically in a smallpox epidemic that the Spaniards had brought in August of 1521, right? And so the Aztecs are defeated by Cortez. You guys know, all right? And then later, not too long later, Pizarro is going to defeat the Incas in South America and Peru, and also find an enormous amount of silver right there. So the Aztecs had a lot of gold and silver. The Incas had a lot of gold and silver. And when the Spanish conquer them and start sending gold and silver back to Spain, it has two major results that are going to be important for understanding what happens in Texas, right? So major result number one, it made the Spanish incredibly horrifically, in some ways, wealthy. They just had literal boatloads of money, gold and silver, making their way from the Americas over to Spain. I mean, it's just obscene the amount of money that they're being able to send over to the Spanish Empire. When they do that, it makes the Spanish very wealthy and militarily powerful. And then it sets off a spree of more Spanish adventurers who are now moving in every which direction, looking for the next great Indian civilization to conquer. And so that's how we get Europeans coming to Texas as early as the 1500s, right? The Spanish are really excited about what they'd found. They make Mexico basically Cortez's land. It's basically Cortez's backyard then. And they start carving out other areas of whatever this is, the Americas, for other Spanish explorations, right? And they give the territory above Mexico to a guy named Panfilio Narvaez, which you can see his name over here in Narvaez's lands, 1526. And they tell this guy, like, hey, go have an expedition. Go find whatever you can find up there. Hopefully it's another Aztec or Incan empire of some sort. So Narvaez gets together an expedition of about 400 guys, none of whom you've probably ever heard of, except for his second in command, a guy named Cabeza de Vaca, right? And they get together here in Havana, and they gas up their ships. They get supplies ready. Cortez has set this example that everybody else now wants to follow, because if Cortez has become incredibly wealthy, all the soldiers in his army became incredibly wealthy. So everybody wants to replicate that. They want to hit the lottery for themselves. And the way to do that is to conquer an Indian civilization of some kind. So they get their boats together in Havana, and they're supposed to go directly to the west right here, to a river called Rio Panuco. This direction over. You see this line right here that goes straight to the left that says intended rudder? That's where they were supposed to go. There's a little expedition over here. They're supposed to go over here and start over this direction. What they didn't know is that there's a Gulf Stream that is going clockwise and taking everybody, if you get caught in the Gulf Stream, toward Florida. So instead of going directly all the way over here, they get caught in the Gulf Stream and accidentally land instead in Tampa Bay, Florida. Look how far off they are when they land at Tampa Bay, Florida, right? Which I don't know how you get this wrong, because at least, you don't have Google Maps. I get it. But didn't you notice the land was on the wrong side of you? That just seems like basic cartography, right? But Panfilio Narvaez, he was a terrible leader, and he had no idea he was in the wrong place, but he was very confident he knew what he was doing. And so he ordered everybody off the boats at Tampa Bay, and he was so confident he was in the right place that he sent the boats away. He sent them away. He said, we don't need you guys. We're fine. And so 400 Spaniards go plowing into Florida looking for the next Aztec empire. Now, you guys know a lot of the story already, but do they find the next Aztec empire? No. What do they find in Florida? That's right. They find Florida. All right. There's a lot of swamps in there, mosquitoes. There are Indians who do not like them and shoot them with arrows whenever they have a chance. And so basically over a couple of months, this expedition falls apart. 150 guys die. It's a disaster. They get lost. They figure out Narvaez is just a terrible leader and he doesn't know what he's doing. So eventually they come out at what they call the Bay of Horses, right here in the Florida Panhandle up here. All right. And they realize, okay, we're lost. Let's just go down the coast a little ways and see if we can find our way home. Remember, they think they're way over down here at Rio de las Palmas looking for Rio Panuco over here. They think they're way over here. They don't realize how far away they are. So they decide to float down the coast. They kill their horses. That's why they call this the Bay of Horses. They kill their horses, eat them, use their hides to make boats, and then they float down the coast over the course of 2 months. And it takes about they go 700 miles over the course of 2 months. Whole time they're starving to death. They're becoming dehydrated. They're losing everything. And a lot of the guys are dying. They get pushed out of the Gulf by the Mississippi River itself. And they've lost sight of land by the time they're passing Louisiana. They are just resigned to death out here in the Gulf Coast. And then something amazing happens. A hurricane, which anybody who's joining us from Houston knows those are no fun. But a hurricane comes in and it pushes all these little boats, which each supposedly has 50 men in it, up against the Gulf. And so Spaniards land in Texas on one of the most important dates that we never talk about, November 6th, 1528. Europeans accidentally, but nonetheless, land in Texas. So this is Cabeza de Vaca, right? Which I love that we call him an explorer when we talk about his time in Texas. He was a refugee. He lands there accidentally, right? But I want to emphasize to you guys, and this is important to emphasize to our students, this is connected to the fall of the Aztecs. It's connected to all that gold and silver, this bigger world. Because why else would it be that 7 years after the fall of the Aztecs, Europeans are in Texas? It's because they're trying to replicate finding that gold and the silver that they were able to find in the Spanish Empire. All right. So Cabeza de Vaca lands on the coast. You guys remember which group he runs into there? Who lives on the coast? It's the Karankawas, right? And so he has quite a few adventures right there. He eventually escapes from the Karankawas who enslaved him, wanders around Texas, meets up with 3 other guys, one of whom was an African fellow named Estebanico. They walk back to Mexico. They escape Texas. They walk all the way down through modern day Mexico, get all the way back to modern day Mexico City, and arrive in July of 1536. 4 survivors of the 400 who left in the expedition back in 1528. Right? That is not a good survival rate. But when they arrive in Mexico City, this is important. Cabeza de Vaca tells his story, and he tells about Texas. And he tells the viceroy in Mexico City about Texas and what he saw up there. And what he tells them is going to launch a new series of expeditions as the Spaniards are going to come up and try to tame this territory. And that is going to lead to the Spanish trying to take over Texas from the native groups that live there already. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to hand it over to my partner in all of this, Courtney, who's going to walk you guys through some teaching resources.
Before I get to the teaching resources, there were a couple of questions that I noted in the chat. Someone asked about the use of alligator oil or alligator fat for insect repellent. And I wanted to know if you wanted to discuss a little bit about that.
I'll tell you what, I think I would. Look, why don't you jump into your resources and I'll answer that in the chat.
Okay, and then there was another question from Rick Barnes about Pineda mapping the Gulf. So those are in there for you.
Oh yeah, Pineda, that's right. I would love to talk about that. All right, I will jump into the chat. I'll see you guys there.
Okay, and my name again is Courtney Abubakar. I've been teaching Texas history for the past 8 years, and I just love making material for it. So I hope that y'all can benefit from some of the things that I've been using in my class. If you have not yet opened up the Word doc, it's not a Word document, it's a Google document, in the classroom for today's resources, I encourage you to go do that now. I will also be putting it up on this screen, so you could just follow along here if you like. But if you go into the classroom under teacher materials, lectures, under classwork, there is a Google Doc called Day 1 Teacher Materials. It should prompt you to make a copy of it, as pretty much all of the materials will. So anything that I have posted and shared with you to use, when it has you make the copy of it, that copy becomes yours. You can do whatever you like to the material. You can add to it, subtract from it, edit it, whatever you like. So let me go ahead and share my screen to share with you the first 2 materials that coincide with Andrew's presentation so far. Give me a moment. Share. Let's see here. Okay. All right. So we are on day 1. Oh, it didn't share. Let me see. Sorry. Share. Okay. All right. So if you see this, this is what the material looks like, compilation of resources for Texas history, and this is all the materials for day 1. I have included 2 assignments or activities per section that Andrew presents. And in most of these assignments, I have created the materials at 3 different levels of academic ability, because probably most of y'all's classrooms are like mine, where I have students who can do an average amount of work, or like an average academic level of work. I have students who require special education or 504 accommodations and modifications in their work on the lower end of the academic level. And then I have students who are incredibly advanced and can do much higher work. So for most of these assignments, I have created the work at 3 different levels, and I haven't made the work too different. So basically what I'm saying is, if you have a class of academic students and then you have 2 students who require an accommodated version of work, you can use the grade level assignment and still hand out the what I'm calling foundations level assignment, because low level sounds, it has a negative connotation to it. But the foundations level is the level of work that is good for students with accommodations or students who need extra supports and scaffolding. And they're meant to be that you could hand out the grade level assignment, the foundations level assignment, and the advanced level assignment within the same class period, because I mean, we all know that there's a wide array of abilities in each one of our classes, and the students wouldn't be lost. They'd be able to follow along at whatever level they're at. So if you were to go to your day 1 and click on the odd one out slides, it will prompt you to make a copy of the material. I've opened it. I don't know if it transfers over. Do you now see my odd one out? Yes. Okay, good. So the odd one out activity is an activity that I absolutely love. It takes not a whole lot of prep on the front end, and it's excellent for getting students into discussions, getting them thinking, not just in terms of like regurgitating information that they've already learned, but using higher levels of thinking to complete the assignment. So what it is, the directions are on slide 2, but I'll talk you through it. I have made this one with 5 slides of pictures. So on slide 3, image set 1, I have chosen 4 pictures kind of at random. There are some themes that go throughout the pictures, but I've chosen these pictures kind of randomly of just 4 images of either natural Texas or the early Texas people. And the students use these slides to fill out a worksheet. Let me pull up this worksheet. Can y'all see the worksheet? Did it switch over? Everybody sees the worksheet?
We can
Yes.
see it. Yep.
All right. So this worksheet goes with the slides. And what the students will do is use the slides. Whoops, this keeps coming away. My goodness. Okay. The students will use the slides to try and find a common theme that runs throughout 3 of the pictures, leaving one of the pictures out. Either it doesn't fit the theme at all, or it doesn't fit the theme as well as the other pictures do. And there's no single right answer here. So this really leaves it open to interpretation. As long as they use evidence and they use inferences from the pictures, they're most likely going to be right. So if I'll give y'all about a minute just to take a look at these 4 images on image set 1. And what you're trying to do is find a theme that runs through 3 of the images, whether it's natural resources or shelters or people getting food or a certain region of Texas. And you're trying to find one image that doesn't quite fit with that theme. And again, like I said, there's a lot of different ways that you could organize and group these, and a lot of different ways that you could be right. So I'm going to give you about a minute. Type in the chat a theme that you see, and then which image doesn't fit within the theme. I'll give you a minute. Go for it. One of these things is not like the other. Yes, exactly. So I see image 3 as the image that does not fit in. Kathy Eads, if you want to unmute yourself, or anybody can type in what they think does not belong, or they can unmute themselves and share what they say does not belong. I see some image 2s that don't belong. I would love to hear what makes these images not belong. Okay, so I see the herd of bison doesn't fit in. Image 3 does not have any trees like the other images, okay?
That's what I would put this is Kathy, that I would put that there's no trees. There are large animals that aren't in the other ones. And that's about all.
Like it. Anyone else have any images that don't fit? Brandon Ramirez, I think 3 does not fit because it shows the Great Plains, whereas the other images seem to represent the North Central Plains. I like that one a lot. Image 3 looks more like a forest. 3 does not have any building materials. I think 2 because of the hunting and gathering and how the natives lived. Okay, so excellent. So my point is this can get discussions going. You could have some students say, no, 3 doesn't fit because it's just animals, or 2 doesn't fit because, it's just a forest and the rest are all showing something about, maybe food, Native American food. But this gets the students talking. It makes them think at higher levels, grouping things, categorizing things, and what doesn't fit in. And then as they do this, they would be filling in their information. So at the advanced level, and then I would also use this for the academic or the grade level version, but I would change up how much I required them to write. Typically for students who work at a more advanced level, I would require more writing. I would require more, good sentence structure, complete sentences. So for image set 1, you're describing 3 images that share the similarities. So we could say, image 1 was a picture of people fishing in a lake. Image 2 was just a forest. Actually, sorry, you would share the 3 images that you believe had a commonality. So image 1 was the people fishing. Image 3 was bison. That could be food. Image 4 was, I've already forgotten what it was. And then in the complete sentence at the bottom, explain the odd one out. So if you thought it was the forest, I would say image 2 with the forest was the odd one out because da 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 da. So with each of these, they're describing the image, and then they're describing the image that they felt did not fit and having to explain why. There are things you can do to scaffold this for grade level. You can give them a sentence stem. So where it says in a complete sentence, rather than just saying, write your sentence, which a lot of my students didn't know how to even begin that. You could class workshop a sentence stem or give them the sentence stem and then have them use that stem to write their answer. So image blank did not fit because blank. And then if you open up the foundations level work, most of the foundations level work I made with my special education 504 students who have limited writing ability in mind. So these were going to be a lot more scaffolded to help with students with literacy struggles. So for this foundations one, they wouldn't be doing all of that extra work. They would just take image set 1 and they would fill in the sentence stem. So image blank. Image 4 is the odd one out because blank. Image set 2. Image 3 is the odd one out because blank. So that gives them a little bit more literacy supports for the students who aren't going to be able to write here the full description of this image, the full description of this image, the full description of this image, and a complete sentence saying why the 4th one does not belong. So back to here, it goes through lots of different images with, human effects on environment, different maps. You can use this for charts. There's some artifacts here, shelters, there's anything you can use this for. And I also love this because it can be a complete lesson by itself. You can get several slides like I've done here, put a bunch of images on the slides related to whatever topic you're talking about, and then have them complete a worksheet. Or this could be 1 slide, 4 pictures, and it can be a warm-up or an exit ticket. You can also keep like a running slide presentation set of just any images from Texas geography, Texas history, Texas whatever. And then if you have like 5 extra minutes or 10 extra minutes at the end of class, I know that there's so much we have to cram in that's probably unlikely, but if you have extra time at the end of class, you can pull up one of these and just have it as a quick little filler for them to still be using their minds, still be using their brains and working with these higher level type of thinkings. That's not a word. Anyway, okay. So any questions here? Any thoughts on this? Any ideas about how you might use it in your own class or how to make it better? I'm always open to suggestions here. Let me pull up my chat so I can see. Here we go. I see journals. I would love to hear more about journals if that is a recommendation or a suggestion. Do you like to do this as a hard copy or digitally? I love paper, and I think there is the lost art of students being able to write out their thoughts. And in a document, it might be too easy for them to just like spell check, and they still won't even do that most of the time. I prefer doing things like this on paper, but it would be really easy to adjust this for a digital format. You could put the worksheet into Google Forms. You could turn it into a fillable PDF. You could put it into any kind of digital format, and it would also work. Or you could post the slides on an educational platform like Google Classroom, and then have that available for them there digitally. So you don't have to print a bunch of pictures or put them up at the front of the room and then have the whole class go through it together at the same time. If you wanted them to do it individually, you could pop the slides into the classroom, print the worksheet, or have it in digital format, and they could do it like that also. 4 corners with group discussion. Oh, I like that. And a suggestion for using this as 4 corners. So you could make one of the corners for image 1, one corner for 2, 3, and 4 for a full class, like full body movement kind of activity. Love that. This would be great for fast finishers. Yes, excellent. Some ways to modify it for your English language learners. A lot of times, so I've had students in my classes who were very bright, but they didn't have the language because they spoke Spanish at home and they were still learning English in school. And then they get dumped into a history classroom. I cannot imagine how difficult that is. So typically what I would use for that is the foundations work. Even though that typically is something I think of for more of students who need special education supports, most of the time those special education supports have to do with building literacy. And so giving the foundations to an English language learner does not signify in any way that they are on a lower level of work, but those foundations level work, I love to work in a lot of literacy building tools. So I would just I had a really bright student in an advanced class, but he barely spoke English. He understood a lot more than he could speak, but he barely spoke English. And so I would give him the foundations tools, the foundations assignments, which build in the sentence stems. That way he's not trying to put together a full sentence in a different language. He's just filling in the parts with the keywords and things that he would need to know. Do I make these daily or weekly? You can do this however you want. I would use, like, this is one of the easiest things to put together for a lesson that could take all of class, because the discussion that it promotes is really excellent. But like I said, it also could just be a warm-up. You know, if you need a warm-up for kids coming in, or you need an exit ticket to see if they got something about the regions, put up 4 pictures, and then have them, if you don't have like a worksheet to go with it, you can give them a little slip of paper or an index card, something where they write their name, they write what they think about the picture that doesn't fit, and they turn it in. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I think that was a lot of questions and I need to move on to the next thing. The second material I made, oh gosh, this was really a passion project that I made a few years ago when I started getting into Dungeons and Dragons. So God, this thing needs to go away. How do I make this black bar move? Okay, so if you go back to your day 1, you'll see Texas Regions Tabletop Game. As Andrew said, geography matters. And as he also said, no one just wants to, I'm paraphrasing, but just learning geography can be just, you know, here's the region of Texas, here's the plants that are in Texas, here's whatever. And in the beginning of when I was teaching, we would do notes, or we would do stations with notes, and it was always just dull. So this Texas Regions Tabletop Game I made with the intent of giving the students a way to get the information about each region and take notes on it, and to gamify that. So if you're opening up these, or if you're just following along with me, this comes with 3 different materials. The first one is slides. And these slides operate sort of as a deck of cards. There are about 8 to 10 cards per region. You'll see here coastal plains, piney woods. If I put this on a slideshow, each card gives you the region that you're in. It gives you some area within the region, like here, the piney woods. It gives you images that represent what you're going to see on the slide. And then it will either talk about wildlife and vegetation, climate, landforms, or encounters with indigenous people. And then it gives you a scenario. So here, for example, you've heard this area is full of a diverse population of plants and animals, big-eared bats, woodpeckers, little rat-like animals with long noses called shrews, bobcats, cottontail rabbits, water animals like river otters, bullfrogs, and catfish, even larger animals like deer and foxes. This place is rich with wildlife. So it gives them a scenario, giving them information, and then it gives them, it gives them the information, and then it gives them a scenario that they need to do something about. But before we look at that scenario, I want to show you the other two materials here. The second material is a map. It covers a lot of what Andrew had on the map that he was showing us of geographic landforms of Texas. You see the Piney Woods, the Balcones Escarpment, Chihuahua Desert, Llano Estacado. And you can print this in an 8x11. You can print this if you have like a really good printing department. You can get this blown up to like a 2x3 foot and do this as a group. But you have this map that goes with these playing cards, and then each student has a worksheet where they're going to be taking notes on the information that they get from this game. So here's how it would work. We read through this wildlife and vegetation, and then you could set a certain amount of notes you want the students to take. For higher level classes, for advanced classes, you could say, 3 to 5, 5 to 7. For grade level classes, you could say fewer. For students who really struggle with literacy, have them choose one thing to write, but you have them pick something or a group of things from each card so that they take notes. So if we're in this region is the coastal plains, I would slide down to coastal plains and make sure the students know that, because a lot of them are just going to start writing right here. Well, I wrote it in the wrong spot. Yes. So coastal plains, wildlife and vegetation, choose 3 to 5 things and take your notes. After they've taken their notes, then the game begins. So this toolbar is driving me crazy. Oh, look at that. Okay. All right. Then the game begins. So you would come back to the game, and this second part gives them a scenario. So here, you and your expedition are hungry and desperate for some meat. You decide to go hunting in the piney woods, but be careful. There are deadly animals too, like water moccasins and alligators. Now here is the one thing in all of the materials that is not included. You would need to buy it if you want to play this game. Nothing else do you have to buy at all. But in order to play this, you need a set of 20-sided die, one for each group. I did groups of 4 or 5. So one group would have a 20-sided die, and then they would roll to see how well they do in this scenario. So you roll your 20-sided die, and if you roll a 1 through 5, you can look down here and see what your result was. And this is just to make things a little silly, so they have an element of play in this. So if I rolled a 3, oh snap, you got your leg bitten off by an alligator while walking through the marshy tall grass. Your friends barely saved your life. 6 through 10, you hear the sounds of tasty, tasty animals, but you just can't catch anything. No luck, you're still hungry. 11 through 15, after many long hours of searching, you were able to hunt 2 rabbits and a gray fox. Your expedition gets to have a bigger meal. And then my toolbar is in the way. 16 through 20, hot diggity dog, you were able to, I can't see the rest of it because my toolbar is in the way. But it goes in, from bad to really good. And that part is mostly just for fun. But the points add up. Keep track of them here. So if you rolled a 4, you would keep track of your 4 points. Now I did this where in the group, each person was playing individually against each other because I had some very competitive classes. That took a lot longer. When I did it as the group is collectively trying to get points, that was actually better. So I set some number like 50 or 80 or 100 points. And once they get that number of points as a group, they can move on out of that region. So I'd write down my 4 points. We have our notes. Then the next person would go. They would pick a new card. So in order for this to work, one other thing I would say is I tried it to where you could just hop all over every region, but that was a mess. So I printed the deck of cards. I printed 2 slides per page. I used our school's color printer, cut them in half, stacked all of the cards for one region together, and started every single group in that region. So group 1, you're starting in coastal plains. Group 2, you're starting in coastal plains. Everybody's starting in coastal plains. And then once, let's say group 2 gets their 50 or their 80 points to move out of their coastal plains, they come trade in the cards to you. You give them, they can pick the next region they want to go to, or if you want to stay kind of geographically making sense, they'd have to pick one that they're next to. You give them the next set of cards and they keep playing. And in this way, you're not just, standing at the front of your room for 3 days saying, this is this region, here's the animals that are there, here's the climate that's there, take notes on all of this. They're getting it set up and kind of having them understand how it works might take a minute, but once the game is rolling, they are teaching themselves through playing this game. And there's some silly things that could happen, like their legs can get bitten off, which no one's going to die. It doesn't actually affect anything in the game, but it's just like, oh, remember that was the region where you got your leg bitten off by the alligator. Alligators are in that region. So it's just another way to kind of give information in a way that's not dry and just having me standing at the front of the room and talking for days on end. So that is that. There's only one version of these materials. I do not have advanced grade level and foundations for this material, but like I said, I would just tell my foundation students, like, hey, just write one thing from each card. And then I tell my advanced students, like, maybe write 5 to 7. So that includes more writing. I see some things here in the chat. Mixed level teams, that's a great idea. Can I use Google Earth to compare the two from there to now for the map? I'm not sure if I understand that question, but yeah, putting Google Earth into an activity would be awesome. Anything else to say here? Any questions about this? Because I feel like this could be a complicated game.
I was going to say, in the interest of time, maybe you guys can put any questions for Courtney into the chat, and you guys can finish up with that. And then I'm going to pick up the narrative from here. But thank you. That was beautiful. My son, I think I told Courtney this. My son loves Dungeons and Dragons. This would have been perfect for him.
Yes.
When he was in 7th grade and was rolling his eyes about geography, and didn't help when he complained at the dinner table, because I'm like, no, geography matters. He goes, I don't care, Dad. I just don't care. Like, gamifying it really does make a big difference, I think, is a really cool thing. Okay. So I'm going to pick up where Courtney left off and pick up with the story left off. Cabeza de Vaca has entered Mexico City. He's entered the chat in Mexico City. And he is telling everybody what he's found in Texas. And what Cabeza de Vaca tells them is that there's these amazing Native American groups back up in Texas. They have all these incredible cultures. And really, it's Cabeza de Vaca is the reason we know as much as we really do about the Karankawas or the Caddos or the Atacapas or the Cuiltecans. He provides one of the very first accounts of these people. But in Mexico City, they only had one question for Cabeza de Vaca. Was there gold up there? And Cabeza de Vaca is like, well, I guess maybe there was some. I think I heard about a village that was a little bit north that, had some gold and stuff. And so the Spanish say, let's launch some expeditions then. That's all they really heard. That's all they really wanted to know. Which brings us to our central question for section 2. How did the arrival of Europeans, when they do really get to Texas, influence the lives of the Native American societies that they encountered? And in a bigger sense, this is, what we're always talking about in history, why things matter, right? What was the significance of the Spanish explorations in Texas? For my son, when he took 7th grade, my daughter who just took it, they want to know, why do I need to know this? Like, why is this valuable? And so trying to give them this larger sort of sense of this matters so you can understand what happens next. And these bigger stories, I think, is really important, right? So in Mexico City, when Cabeza de Vaca gets back, they launch expeditions to try to find the gold that supposedly Cabeza de Vaca might have seen somewhere in the distance up there in Texas. And so very quickly, they launch the Coronado expedition. I love this portrait, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, because he looks terrifying. This is not a guy you want to have over for dinner. He leaves Mexico City with about 400 Spanish troops and about 1,000 Native Americans from central Mexico, who, you guys have seen these maps, I'm sure, like they're up there to try to find what Cabeza de Vaca might have seen. And so, Cabeza de Vaca could not give them like a good explanation of exactly where he'd been. And so they're just sort of loosely trying to go, we're going to go north for a long time and then maybe take a left at a mountain. I don't know. When you see these maps and textbooks and things that have Coronado's route, it is an absolute guess match all over the place. We don't really know where Coronado exactly was. most of the time. We have a few places we have a good sense of. We do know he ends up at the Grand Canyon at one point, because why not take a side trip, right? To the Grand Canyon, that's fun. But they're going up, and as they go through all these places, they're encountering, Zuni and Pueblo Indian groups, and always saying, "Where's the gold?" And the Indians always say the same thing that the Indians on the Veracruz coast told Hernan Cortez. It's like, we don't have gold, but you know who does? Our enemies, way that way, out that direction, right? So Cortez ends up on this long goose chase, so basically, where he's marching through. So this is Frederick Remington imagining of what that might have looked like of Cortez marching along the Llano Escotado, the staked plains, as he calls it, the plains of Texas up there, where he said there's not a tree or pretty much anything anywhere you could fix your sights on. And he's looking for these cities of gold, as they're often called, whatever they could find. At some point, he picks up an Indian guide, Zuni Indian, who they called the Turk. So that's supposedly who's here in the front of this painting. The Turk just leads them on and on and on. They go through the panhandle of Texas. By the way, this has Comanches and Kiowas on it. Those guys were not there yet, so don't trust maps. Ends up in Kansas. And at some point, I guess Coronado decided he did not like Kansas because he kills the Turk for lying to him, turns around, and comes on back. And he does encounter the Wichitas, which are actually over here. And he does encounter the Apaches, so they encounter these tribes. He explores the plains, comes back, and heads back down to Mexico City. All right? This happens from 1540 to about 1542. At the same time, there's another expedition, a Spanish expedition that comes to Texas. This one led by this guy, Hernando de Soto, which De Soto had been a part of the expedition that had defeated the Incas, and he'd gotten really wealthy from that. So he became governor of Cuba and decided he wanted to be even wealthier. So he's going to launch another expedition to explore. So he leaves Cuba and he lands, and you can see down here on the bottom right, he lands again in Florida, Tampa Bay, right where Cabeza de Vaca and company had landed, except he's there on purpose. And they go through Florida, and you can see they explore most of the American South. They go through Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, dip back through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. For reasons known only to them, they spend an enormous amount of time in Arkansas. At some point during all of this, De Soto himself actually dies, and then his second in command, Luis Morosco de Alvarez, takes over. And then they come into East Texas. You guys remember what tribe was right there in East Texas, right? Those are the Caddos. They don't find much of anything except Caddos, come out the Mississippi River. They're real proud of themselves. That happens at almost the exact same time as Coronado's expedition, in the early 1540s. So by the time you get to the mid-1540s, there's been 3 different expeditions, explorations, whatever you want to call them, by Spaniards of Texas, right? You've got Cabeza de Vaca along the coast over here, where he meets the Atacapas, Carancoas, Coahuiltecans, comes out here, hits some Humanos on his way out of Texas. Then you have Coronado in the Panhandle, meeting Apaches and Wichitas, and then you've got the De Soto, Alvarez Morosco expedition that comes in over here and meets the Caddos. This is, by the way, why we know about these particular groups. There's probably lots more groups here in the central part of Texas during this time that we've never heard of and know nothing about. All right. So the limitations of what we can know in part is because the Spaniards who report about this is how we know about a lot of these early groups in Texas. All right. So what were the major results of these explorations by the Spanish in Texas? Right. Major result number 1, did they find any gold? No, they did not. And that is such an important thing, because the Spanish are going to judge the value of any place in the New World on how much wealth it will produce. All right. That is a fundamental thing. Our students, I'm sure we often say this, but we often hear God, gold, and glory as motivation for all of these kind of explorations. But it's really mostly just gold. All right. Everyone loves glory. That's fun. And God's a nice justification for the Spanish. But what the Spanish are focused on is the material wealth that places can produce. So when they find no gold, this is important. Texas isn't worth anything to the Spanish. They decide this place is just not valuable because it doesn't have what they're looking for, another Aztec or Incan empire, right? So that's the first major result. But there are two other major results that come from the Spanish coming into the territory that's going to matter enormously for our story. The second major result is that the Spanish leave behind horses, all right? And that is going to transform life for many of the Indian groups within Texas, because these Indian groups, particularly the Apache, were going to transform themselves from a very weak tribe that was on foot in the plains, the area that everybody else had left, to becoming one of the most powerful military forces in Texas when they adopt the horse, because the horse is a military weapon. It makes you faster, stronger, and more fearsome than any of your enemies. And so the Apaches go from being a small tribe to one that's powerful, very well able to feed itself by hunting more bison, but they raid their neighbors. They'll actually raid the nearby Cumanos to death before the Spanish even return, right? And this will be the source of creating the Comanches, because these horses, they're going to move north along the plains. They're going to go into eastern Colorado and Wyoming, modern day Colorado and Wyoming. And the Shoshones will adopt the horse as well, or some of them will. And those groups will turn themselves into what become the Comanches. And then they will come down the plains later on and come into Texas, right? So you can see the Spanish are going to leave for about 150 years. But while they're gone, what they've left behind is going to be transforming Texas for these native groups and these native groups' relationship to the geography. Because again, now the Apaches are much stronger, right? The other thing the Spanish, of course, leave behind is disease. I mean, just everywhere they go, they bring European diseases of all kinds, smallpox probably being the most virulent of all of it. And this kills, I mean, obscene numbers of Native American groups, not just in Texas, all over the Americas, because they have no immunities to these diseases. And this will decimate the Indian populations in Texas. So when the Spanish leave in the 1540s, they're not going to come back till the 1680s, 1690s. In that time in between, the Indian populations are going to collapse compared to what they used to be, because the death rates are about 90%. Think about that. 9 out of 10 of any group is going to die in the Americas because of the smallpox and various other diseases that are going to run ravaging all over. So the population of Caddos collapses, Karankawas collapses. All these different groups go down. They spring back up, but they don't ever get back to the same levels that they once were before. So when the Spanish return, things in Texas are going to be different, right? But the Spanish don't really care, because the Spanish are looking around and saying, okay, Texas up here, not worth anything. We're just going to ignore that. They're going to focus on Mexico down here, and they're going to focus on the Caribbean, and they're going to focus on South America, right? Because those are the places that produce. And what do those places produce? They produce some gold, but they produce massive amounts of silver, right? The Americas become, for the Spanish, just an ATM machine that you got a card for, and you just hitting the buttons and saying cash out, cash out, cash out, and it's just flying out of the machine, right? They are pulling massive amounts of silver out of South America, out of Central America, and particularly out of Mexico right here. And this is how the Spanish will now organize themselves in the New World. They're going to have a viceroyalty of Peru and a viceroyalty of New Spain, because those are the two main places they're pulling money out. So you look here on the map, where is Texas on all this? It's on the far fling edge of anything, right? As it's the little strip of grass right behind your garage and behind the shed, actually behind the garage, that no one cares about. It's completely ignored. It's completely out, all right? As the Spanish focus on getting silver. But the Spanish also encounter a problem in Mexico in particular, what will become Mexico, that will have an effect on how they try to settle in Texas later on. Which the problem is this. You guys see all these, this is Mexico right here, right? You guys see all these little towns, right? These all spring up north of Mexico City. Mexico City is the defeated Tenochtitlan, right? All these little towns are mining towns. The Spanish would spread out and they would find silver veins, and then they would mine them and pull out the silver. So Zacatecas, you heard of Zacatecas. It is a massive silver mining. It's huge amounts of money coming out. And that's what the Spanish want. They bring it down from Zacatecas or wherever to Mexico City, then where it's counted up. Then they ship it over to Veracruz, where it's loaded on ships, and then it's sent to Madrid in Spain. That's the Spanish model. They're making so much money. But the problem they run into is that while you have all these mine towns everywhere, and even though there's been a death rate of 90% killing all these Indians, there's still a lot more Indians in these areas than there are Spaniards. There's just not that many Spaniards, and a whole lot of it Indians. And what do the Indians think of the Spaniards? Not very much, right? They don't like them, and they don't like these silver shipments. They don't like the mines. And so the silver shipments are constantly being attacked by the different Indian groups. When you're taking wagon trains from Zacatecas down to Mexico City, they'd be attacked all along the way, and this was a huge problem. So the Spanish had to come up with a solution for this, and they came up with a two-part solution. Kind of came up with what I call a short-term solution to this problem and a longer-term solution to this problem, both of which are going to end up eventually in Texas. All right, so what's the short-term solution? Short-term solution are presidios. I know you guys have heard of these. I know you guys talk about them when you teach your class, but they're forts, right? Presidio comes from the Latin presidium, sort of a Roman idea of a fort that protects a particular area around it. And so they set up all these different forts. And the idea is that there'd be a line of forts from like Zacatecas to Mexico City. And along the way, the soldiers from one fort would escort the silver shipments to the next fort. Then they'd hand it off to those soldiers and they'd escort it to the next fort. And you have this line of forts that will help safely get the silver all the way down to Mexico City. That's great in the short term. And it works in the short term. Problem is, in the long term, you're still surrounded by Native American groups who hate you. And so the Spanish have to come up with some other way of fixing that problem in a long-term kind of idea. And so their long-term solution to the security problem is what we call the mission system. All right. Now, the idea of the mission system was to transform the Indians from being hostile enemies into being loyal subjects of the Spanish crown. That was the idea, and that was the intention. And when I ask my students about missions and what they are, they'll think of something like this. This is Mission San Jose, south of San Antonio. And they always see the church and they say, well, the purpose of the missions was to bring Catholicism, Christianity, but specifically Catholicism, to the Indians. And I'll say, yes, but that's really only part of it. There was a much bigger mission for the missions than just making them Catholic, all right? The real purpose of the mission was, again, to turn hostile Indians into good Spaniards. And that meant civilizing, for the Spanish, the Indians to be like Spaniards. So when you think of a mission, you look at this. The church, the parish church that is built onto the mission is only one small part of a big complex. And the idea is that the Indians would move into these missions and they would live there like a boarding school. And then when they were there, they would be trained to be Spaniards, which, yes, it meant being Catholic, but that was only a piece of it. It meant growing your food in the field. It meant being a blacksmith. It meant wearing pants and speaking Spanish and doing all the things that Spaniards did. And this whole idea was, again, to try to transform these Indians into being Spaniards. And if this worked, this is the idea, the theory was, if this worked, then the mission would become a little village of no longer Indians, but now Spanish, hopefully tax-paying subjects who would not be hostile to you. They would be loyal and supportive, and you would have transformed this bigger problem. So you can see that's a long-term idea and long-term solution. It depends on the Indians wanting, of course, to become Spaniards and abandoning their cultures and their ways and all those things we talked about earlier about how they comported themselves. But it was how the Spanish try to deal with the silver issues, all right? This will eventually come to Texas, as the mission system will come to Texas when Spain finally decides to come back. But that's the source of it, and that's the real idea behind it and why the Spanish thought they could use it. And it worked, I'd say, moderately well-ish within central Mexico. Presidios worked very well. The missions, sort of not, but well enough to keep going, all right? But meanwhile, other European powers are coming to the Americas, right? And that is because the Spanish have been so successful, right? They're sending out massive amounts of silver from Veracruz in the Gulf Coast. And it's going out here past Florida and back to the Americas. The English, the Dutch, the French start raiding them. This is where we get Pirates of the Caribbean and Johnny Depp and all that sort of stuff down there. You have the English showing up in the New World because they're afraid of being left behind, because the Spanish are having so much money, they're having such a large military that it's scaring the heck out of it. And they established Jamestown in 1607. And then you have the French, who are trying to get a foothold as well in the Americas. And they come up here to Canada, where we have the fabled Robert La Salle show up, right? And so it is the French who show up at this particular moment that scare the Spanish, that will bring the Spanish back up to Texas, and again transform the situation within Texas one more time. So I'm going to pause there and hand the mic back to Courtney, who's got a couple more really cool resources to share with you guys.
Yes. Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay. Share. All right. This is another activity. So this is coming back to Cabeza de Vaca, which I know Andrew mentioned in the first section, but this is still with Spanish exploration. This is another activity that you can use in pretty much any circumstance in a history class where there's a good narrative, where you tell a story. And rather than just have the students take notes on the story, I have my students storyboard it. So you take like a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, you have the students fold it in half until they get the certain number of little squares. Like if you want 8 little squares for 8 boxes in a story, they fold it, open it up, and now you have 8 little squares for your story. They number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, give it a title slide. And then the goal is for me to tell this story, the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca's adventure. I tell it in pieces, or any story, but in this case, it's Cabeza de Vaca. I tell it in pieces, and then I give the students about 2 minutes to create kind of like a comic strip of what they've just heard. And with Cabeza de Vaca's story in particular, because of his book that he writes afterwards, there are so many excellent quotes that can go along with this story. So for a lot of times, I just have them storyboard and draw the picture, and I'll put a story into about 8 pieces. But for this one also, I'm scrolling down here. So the story segment, starting with the part number 1, I give us the first part of the story that you would read or kind of, dramatize up for the students. And then there is a quote from Cabeza de Vaca's book that goes with that part of the story. And what you can do with this to add an extra element of thinking here is I have made a document with just the quotes from the story in the order that they go. It might help to put like an A, to not like to put A, B, C, D, E on them, but put it all out of order. That way it's easier to check when they have it in the right order. But either way, you can print these out, cut these out, and then give them to a student or a pair of students working together. And as you're telling the story, you give them maybe 2 or 3 minutes afterwards to locate which quote goes with what part of the story that they just heard, and then to draw a visual representation of that story in their little comic strip. And it's even for students, I let them know I'm not grading you on your artistic ability. And even for students who cannot draw, this is a really awesome way to get their minds thinking about what they just heard. So they internalize the story, and they are essentially taking notes. They're just taking pictographic notes on it. And a lot of times it sticks a lot better. I did this once for LaSalle, and this one little girl kept drawing like a spirally French mustache. And every time that he showed up in her story, the mustache would get bigger. So the students get really, really creative with this. And it's a really good way to get a narrative story told to the students and have them do some written activity with it. That's not just taking notes. I want to make sure I don't go over on time for this. So if you have any questions about what I'm talking about as I'm talking, go ahead and put them in the chat. And like Andrew suggested, I'll get to those as soon as I am done with my segment. So this is storyboarding. You can storyboard any narrative, and then throwing in the quotes for the primary source element of it is just an added thing you can do. And at the top of this, it gives you, at the top of the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca's story. It tells you what to do if you just want to have them storyboard, and then if you want to also include in the matching. So there is that. The second thing to do, if you look down here, Cabeza de Vaca, skills, evidence, and reasoning. And anytime we have primary sources in my class, the students, there's a collective groan because they know that it's old language, it's language they're not going to understand. There's going to be words that trip them up, and it's always a challenge because a lot of students struggle with literacy for writings that are geared towards modern day readers, let alone struggling with, readings that have words like sinews and foes in them. So this is another excerpt from Cabeza de Vaca's book, The Journey of Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. This is from the Portal to Texas History. And this is talking about the American Indians' fighting capabilities. And basically, he's talking about how excellent they are fighting in certain situations, like out on the open plains. It uses some words that I assume students won't know, like sinews, foe, muskets, dread, overcome. So what I would do is another literacy building tool is multiple read-throughs of a thing. So you can print this, give it to students or partners, and then I would just read through it first. One of the next steps you can do for literacy building is the second time I read through it, have the students mark the phrase breaks. For example, if I say the strings of their bows are made of deer sinews, they fight in a crouching posture and while shooting. So the phrase breaks there, they would do like a line after a full stop. The strings of their bows are made of deer sinews. And then the students would draw a line there, because a lot of you, I'm sure, know, you see students just struggling to get each word out. The strings of their bows are made of deer. They fight. And it's monotonous. And they don't always know where the breaks should come. And so this is one way to scaffold for students who are really just struggling to get one word out at a time. So you can have them write in the phrase breaks, 2 slanted lines at a period, 1 slanted line when you just take a breath. They fight in a crouching posture, and while shooting at each other, they talk and dart from one side to the other to dodge arrows, or however you break it up. That way, whenever the students eventually get to reading it on their own, they can kind of see when they get a break. So I would read through once, just myself. I would read through again and have them do phrase breaks if they really need extra literacy supports. And then there are 3 levels of worksheets that go with this. So the first one is the advanced level. It takes the words that were in bold and it breaks them up to where they use the context of the reading to try and determine what these words mean without looking them up. So I think the word sinews means blank because blank, and then use it in your own sentence. And they would need to go back here. They are made of deer sinews. Okay, well, if it's a bow and arrow and it's made of a deer sinew, I know it's some part of a deer. And they just try and reason out what this could mean. Even if they never get the exact definition, they're just trying to use context. The grade level version of this takes out the make your own sentence. I just think sinews means this because this. And the foundations level gives them a lot more supports here where it gives them options to choose from. I think sinews means feet or hooves, food and waste, tough tendons, teeth and bones. The next part, going back to the advanced, is trying to make a claim based on that reading, using evidence, and then providing your reasoning for the claim you've made. So for the advanced level, the guiding question for this claim they're going to make is, what did Cabeza de Vaca believe about the American Indians' ability to fight battles against the Spanish? So the advanced students would go back to this. What is he saying? Are they good fighters? Are they bad fighters? Do they use certain kinds of tactics? They're going to make a claim about it. And then using evidence from the reading, they're going to refer back to this claim. And then in their reasoning, they're going to kind of explain, like, I think that he says they're good fighters because he has this quote from the reading, which I think means this. And then they would use that information to write their own 3 to 5, like a short paragraph. And even with the advanced, sometimes I'll give them these sentence stems because a lot of times students really struggle with knowing where to start. So the claim, Cabeza de Vaca believed that. Evidence, in his journals, he wrote blank. If they have another one, he also stated blank. Reasoning, these quotes demonstrate that blank, and then they write it out. In the advanced copy of this, in the grade level copy of this, I give them 2 claims and they're opposing. So they're still using a claim, but they can either choose Cabeza de Vaca believed that the American Indians he encountered were better fighters than the Spanish, or that that the Spanish were better fighters than the Native Americans or the American Indians. They would use evidence from they'd pick one of them, cross out the one they don't want, or you can have them do both and try and argue both sides, and they'll see which side has more evidence. And then they're also writing their own paragraph, but I provide the sentence stems that they complete. In the foundations copy, which I would use for SPED 504 or some English language learners, you come down here and it gives you claim 1, the Spanish are better fighters, claim 2, the American Indians are better fighters, and then it takes pieces of the writing in order, and you would judge by each piece of the writing, is he trying to say that the American Indians are better or the Spanish are better? So they would just place a check in whichever box it sounds like. And then their sentence stem and much shorter writing is Cabeza de Vaca believed that the blank were better fighters than the blank. This is evidenced in the passage when he stated, and then they could just go back up here and pick any of the ones that fit with whatever they checked. Coming back to the meeting, that is the materials for that portion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew, and I'll answer any questions you have in the chat.
Hooray! Huzzah! Yay. Okay. Let's see. Let me share my screen back. Yes. Share my screen. All right, guys. All right. Fabulous stuff. Courtney, I love it. All right. So I'm gonna dive in, pick the story back up. So the man with the long curly hair that changes everything. So again, the Spanish have just decided that Texas means nothing. They're focusing on silver, gold, and mostly silver in Mexico and south of there more than anything else. So the question is, how did the arrival of the French influence Spain's approach to Texas? Because as far as the geography is concerned, as far as the Indian groups are concerned, the Spanish don't care about this, right? So why is the French presence? How is that going to shift things as dramatically as we all know that it does? All right. So we start with the French in Canada, exploring, trading with Indian groups. They don't try to convert them very much, so they usually get along pretty well with the native groups more than the Spanish do. And they do a lot of exploring. And that's what La Salle was. He was an explorer, and he explored most of the Great Lakes. And you can see right here, I love this map. And so in 1682, wait, darn it. Stop clicking things. He goes down to the Great Lakes, and it's this dark blue, purplish kind of thing. And he comes down the Mississippi River in a canoe. Imagine doing that in a canoe in 1682. And he's like, look what I found. I found a giant river. This is amazing. I claim this giant river that nobody, I mean, I know the Indians know about it, but nobody else does. It's mine. So here it is. And he goes down this giant river all the way down to the mouth, which is where modern day New Orleans is. New Orleans does not exist yet. And he's like, man, that's big. I'm going to claim that from the French. And it's not just this river, but any river that touches this river is going to be ours. And that'll really impress my king, King Louis the 14th. So that's why we get the name Louisiana from. It's Louis' land, basically. He's just saying, like, this is Louis' land. I'm going to go tell Louis about it. He's going to be so impressed with me. And so he goes back to France, and he runs over to the court of King Louis the 14th, and he says, hey, King Louis, you won't believe what I found. So here's La Salle on the left. Here's King Louis the 14th rocking that hair on the right. And the two of them are having a hair off, it looks like. But La Salle is saying, like, I found all this land. I found this incredible place. And I would like permission to go back and set up a colony there, not because I care at all about this territory, but because it's near the Spanish. And what he actually proposes to King Louis is that they use it, the French, would use it as a raiding point for the Spanish silver ships. King Louis thinks this is a fantastic idea because it's really not going to cost him almost anything. Why would he not do this? If he can mess with the Spanish, that's an upside. If they do actually successfully raid the Spanish, even better, right? So Louis says, go for it, Robert La Salle, knock yourself out. La Salle recruits about 300 people. It's not all men. A lot of these expeditions are all men. This actually includes women and families. It's mostly men, but 300 people on a couple of ships that leave France. And in 1684, and they sail across the Atlantic Ocean going back. And Robert La Salle's goal is to hit the Mississippi River. He wants to basically establish what becomes New Orleans, right? That was his goal. And you can see right here on this map, it's in the green down here. He comes down this way. He has to skirt around what is modern day Cuba, because that was the headquarters for the Spanish at the time, and go around them. And he hits the Gulf Stream over here and misses his mark, not as badly as Cabeza de Vaca's group missed theirs, but he misses by about 400 miles. And instead of getting to Mississippi River in modern day New Orleans, he lands at modern day Matagorda Bay in February of 1685, right? Missing his mark by 400 miles, which I always make fun of that in my class because the students think it's hilarious that they got it so wrong. And I assume 12-year-olds will find it even funnier if they can make fun of someone who's famous about how badly they misnavigated themselves. But he mistakes a bay for a river, which by itself I think is a good example of why geography matters. But here's a woodcut lithograph, not lithograph, a woodcut of what it might have looked like when they're landing there on the Gulf Coast. Who's the welcome committee for the French when they land on the coast right there? You remember who lives right along the coast all the way down toward near Corpus Christi? It's the Karankawas, who had welcomed Cabeza de Vaca by enslaving him, and now they're welcoming the French by basically raiding whatever supplies the French leave on the coast right there every time they come by. But the French get there, they build a fort that's called Fort St. Louis. It actually wasn't really a fort, but some sort of like hut basically that they all kind of huddle in as best they possibly can. And very quickly, La Salle figures out that this is not, as he'd hoped, a river, and definitely not the Mississippi. So he goes looking for the Mississippi that he thinks might be somewhere. He goes in 1685 all the way down to the Rio Grande. Nope, that's not it. Comes back up the next year, walks almost all the way to the Sabine River. Nope, that's not it. And by this time, people have been dying by the dozens and hundreds, really, within his settlement. By 1687, there's only 41 of these guys alive from the original 300. And then their last ship, the Belle, runs aground in the Gulf, and they got no way out of it. So I just tell my students, imagine you're Robert. You're lost. You're not quite sure where you are. You don't have supplies. No one knows where you are. And your last ship ran aground. What are you going to do? And they'll throw out all kinds of ideas. And I would say, yes, those are all good ideas. That's not what they decided to do. What they decided to do, and this is actually true, this is what they decided to do. They decided to walk to Canada. That was their solution. Because what else are they going to do? And so La Salle takes some of the strongest men, and then they walk towards Canada. Along the way, when they get outside of Caddo Village, La Salle's men are just so sick of him at this point that they kill him, throw his body into a ditch, and then they go on without him. And 5 of those guys actually make it all the way back to Canada. You can believe that. We actually have journals from some of these guys about that walk. All right. But the reason this matters is that Robert La Salle's colony is a disaster. It does not work. It is not a success. It does nothing that it's intended to do. All right. Which, again, I find kind of crazy because if you go to Six Flags today, he's the only reason there's a French flag flying over Six Flags. Right. He just gets lost. Good for you, man. All right. But why does he matter? Why is he significant? He's significant because he scares the Spanish tremendously. All right. The Spanish don't care about Texas up here. Remember, it's the little strip of land behind the shed, behind the garage. No one cares about that. But when someone else comes in, it's not that you care about that strip of land. You care about how close that person now is to the stuff you do care about, which for the Spanish were all these silver mines. And so they want to keep the French out because they want to protect the money. They want to protect the silver more than anything else. And so when they hear about La Salle's expedition, the Spanish don't realize it's a disaster from the beginning. The Spanish find this very threatening. And so they launch 11 different expeditions to try to find Robert La Salle. This gives us a sense of just how serious they took that threat, because they launched 6 by land, 5 by sea. They never found him because he was dead by this point. Like they didn't realize what they were looking for just wasn't there anymore. Eventually, they did find a survivor of La Salle's expedition who had actually, say, joined up, but he was found with some Karankawas trying to survive. And he took the Spanish to the remnants of La Salle's original fort. And so all of that had kind of collapsed in on itself. And the Spanish realized that La Salle had failed. But the Spanish had also become convinced that they needed to come back and set up a permanent settlement in Texas in order to survive, to keep out anybody else from coming to Texas. So again, Texas doesn't matter by itself, but now it's being used to keep away the French or anybody else who might threaten the Spanish silver shipments. This is what leads to permanent settlements in Texas, all right? And the early attempts in the 1690s to set up the very first permanent Spanish settlements in the region, all right? And this is, again, we come right back to where we started this entire day with geography matters. Because when the Spanish come back, they have all these different Indian groups to pick from of where they're going to set up their first missions, because they decided to use the mission system and the presidios that had worked okay in central Mexico. That's how they're going to try to settle Texas. But they have to pick which Indian group they're going to missionize to. And they decide that they're not going to do a mission with the Atacapas or the Karankawas because they're too scary. They're semi-nomadic. They're fairly warlike in various sort of ways. They have been very difficult for Beza de Vaca, but really more importantly for the French expedition under La Salle. So the Spanish just don't think they want to mess with them. The Cuiltecans, they're so poor, they're actually begging for missions, but the Spanish don't want to build missions there because they want to move as far east as they possibly can, because the further east they are, the more they can keep out other European powers. And so they eventually choose the Caddos over here, in part because the Caddos, they're far east, but more importantly, they're in a really good geography. And as we said earlier, that made the Caddos very wealthy, very sedentary in villages that the Spanish recognized look a lot like Spanish villages. And so the Caddos look very easy to transform from enemies into Spanish subjects because they look the closest to Spaniards in many ways, in the ways that they live and the ways that they operate with agriculture and all the things that their local geography really makes possible. So the Spanish in 1690 come out and set up some missions outside the Caddo villages. Those missions fail absolutely miserably. And the reason is very simple. The Caddos never want to become Spaniards. The Caddos never want to transform themselves into being Spaniards because they're perfectly happy being Caddos. They're very successful in their lives. They have wonderful culture and everything that they want in society that they've built. They don't want to give any of those things up. And so for 3 years, the Spanish have several missions around the Caddo villages. Not one Caddo voluntarily goes into these missions. They'll trade with the missions. The Caddos are very good at trading with all kinds of groups that show up. So they'll trade with the Spaniards. But when the Spaniards run out of trinkets to trade, the Caddos want nothing to do with them. And when the Spanish show up, what do they bring with them? Disease. And so when the Caddos die of several smallpox, waves of smallpox that overcome them, they basically tell the Spanish missions, you guys either leave or we're going to kill you. And so the missionaries abandon their little missions out there in East Texas. They bury the church bells in the ground, and they skedaddle in 1693 and move back. And so the very first attempt of the Spanish to establish themselves in Texas fails because the strength of the Indian group that they're meeting with, the Caddos, means that the Caddos have no interest in what the Spanish are offering. So with that, I'm going to pause so we have enough time and hand the mic back over to Courtney, who's got a few more resources to give you guys.
Yes, and I will be quick. Okay, so the last section of resources are the first one is Father Cuberta's letters, which he was a father who was in East Texas, and he wrote a bunch of letters back to people in the Spanish government, and then a French threat stations activity. So starting first with Father Cuberta's letters, there's a matching element here, like things to print out and match. And so I have a teacher guide to give the answer key for the matching and to give several different ways that you can present or carry out the materials based on what level of work, like what level of academic ability your students have. So the rest of the materials for this, there are 2 Google drawings. One is the excerpt cards from Father Couberta's letters. They are divided up into 6 different segments, and it's a chunk. For my students who get overwhelmed at this amount of reading, there's a next step coming up that should help them with this. So there's 6 different chunks of Father Couberta's letter that he wrote back to the government. And then what I like to do with very like text heavy primary source documents is I translate it into modern day language. So on this translation cards, here number 1 coincides with F, and F gives us the modern day translation. So 1 says 1690 September, may Jesus live, may the grace and the divine love be with your very reverend paternity. So here, God be with you. God was happy that the American Indians wanted to be baptized, which was the next thing that he said. We didn't get there. But it puts it into a modern translation. So even if they're not understanding every single thing in that excerpt, they can pick out, if they can pick out, and it helps them to be able to pick out these big ideas and big themes and find those big themes in language that they do understand. So here are the translations. And then there are 3 levels of work that go with these. So after, you can have them do it individually. If a student likes to work alone, you can have them team up in pairs of 2 or 3. And then you print out a set of the excerpts, the translations, cut them out. So it takes a little bit of prep work on the front end, but then you give them that set. It helps. I have found that it helps. Even though I put the excerpts as numbers and the translations as letters, I have found that if you're able to, it helps to print out all the excerpts on like blue or one color and then print the translations on a different color, just so it's very obvious. And it will be obvious when they're looking at it, but it can be overwhelming to see the same color of 12 different little slips of paper. So once they have worked individually or with their partner to match these excerpts with their translations, and it helps if you read through it first, maybe read through it and just have them listen. And they can try and like, what do I think he's talking about in general? And then you read through it again, where they just look at the excerpt cards and put those in order. And those already go in order. So 1 is the first part of his letter, 2 is the second part of his letter. So they put those in order so they can read along with you or follow along with you as you're reading. And then on that second read through, they're doing it on their own and they're trying to match it up with the primary source translation. So now they've heard it twice. It should be a little bit more familiar, the words they don't know, and they'll be able to more accurately match up those translations. So for the advanced one, it's simple. Excerpt 1, you write the letter of the translation that you think matches with it, and then the advanced students will write their own translation. There's nothing else to it because this takes a little while. Grade level is the exact same thing, but what I will tell them is I'll give the advanced students a minimum or a maximum thing that they have to write. You need to write at least 3 to 5 sentences summarizing this in your own words. For a grade level, I might say write 1 or 2 sentences. And then for the academic, it looks the exact same, but you really could use the exact same thing on this. I just change the directions that I give them. So this direction is going to say pick 3 or 5 phrases or words. And this is one of the things that I use for my low-level students, for my English language learners, when they see a chunk of text. If a lot of them will just skip it, they'll tell me that I'm just going to skip it. So I say, well, okay, instead of just skipping it, don't read it, but find 3 words, find 5 words, not the or and, but something that you know what it means and you know it comes from our unit. Find 3 or 5 words that are important in this reading and have them write those down. So that is how I would do that for Father Couberta's letters. The second and final thing that I am presenting today is Station's activity on the French threat to the Spanish. So here, there are, this is the station resources. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stations. So you could do this as stations, you could do this as groups. But station 1 shows a map of the mining operations that Mexico had going on. It's also written down here so students know. Station 2 is just a list of all of the wars that the French and the Spanish had been engaged in from like the 1200s to the 1700s. There's a reason for that. Number 3 is the majority of Spanish activity and where exactly it's happening in Central and North America. 4 is a map of LaSalle's expeditions. And then 5 is excerpts from Father Damien Massenet, 2 of these, who was a priest in East Texas. And then again, Father Cuberta. So what they're doing with these stations is, for the advanced, they're writing short answer responses to questions about each station. So station 1 has 3 questions, station 2 has 3 questions, and they're for higher level thinking, so this could take a little bit of time. For the grade level work, there is more multiple choice, same questions, but multiple choice answers and 1 short answer response. And then for the foundations level work, fewer questions and much less writing, and then more supports on the side. Like the first question in the advanced asks, using cardinal directions, describe where the majority of mines are in relation to Texas. For the academic, or for the grade, for the foundations level students, based on this map, where were most of the mines located, it gives them the map, it gives them the locations already listed on the map, and then it gives them the options here. So there's just more supports built in there. And 259, holy guacamole. Okay, that's it anyway. So that worked out perfectly. If there are any questions, I'll be staying on to answer any questions that y'all might have, but I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and turn it back over.
I was just gonna say, so we'll pick up the story tomorrow with the Spanish flailing through the 1700s and the transition toward Mexico. And pick it up basically there, same format, same bat time on Tuesday. So with that, I'll hand it back to Liz.
Yes, I don't have many announcements. We will post the slides from today in Google Classroom, as well as the recording if any of your colleagues were affected by the hurricane or the internet power outages. They'll be able to watch this after the fact. But email us if you have any questions. As Courtney said, we'll stick around for a few minutes if there are any. And same time, same place, same Zoom link tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much, Andrew and Courtney, for a wonderful first session.
Well, thank you guys all for being here, and thank you all.